Hi, everybody. Patrick McFarland here of the Liberty Weekly podcast, coming at you with another episode. This one is, I think, episode 169, and we got CJ Kilmer, Prof CJ from Dangerous History Podcast on the line. How are you doing?
I'm great, Patrick. How are you?
I am very good, and I'm really excited to have you on. If anybody in the audience doesn't know who you are or hasn't listened to your show, how can they find your work?
Yeah, well, if you just type in dangeroushistorypodcast.com into your browser, that'll take you to my homepage. The show is the Dangerous History Podcast. It's syndicated on all the typical podcatcher platforms, that sort of thing. I've been doing it for 7 years, I think next month. Over 200 episodes, another few dozen bonus episodes for supporters of the show. And I've covered all kinds of different topics. I'm currently in the midst of a huge Woodrow Wilson biographical series that I've already been working on for several years at this point. I've done series on Civil War, the U.S. Civil War. I've done series on the American Revolution, number of other different things in various stages of production. So yeah, I've been teaching college history since I think 2006 now. So I've been doing that job as my day job for 15 years now, and then been doing the podcast for 7. So that's my thing. And I come at history from a pretty heavily kind of Rothbardian influence thing. I think there's other elements to my thinking and my worldview that are not like straight up Rothbard clone necessarily. There's particular issues where I might differ from him a little bit, and I think I have other dimensions to how I think about history and things like that than he did. But very heavily influenced. Definitely somebody who's a fan of that whole the Mises crowd. I was very influenced by Ron Paul for sure. So anybody who's sort of in that milieu will very I think quickly appreciate the lens through which I look at history.
Yeah, and I really liked your series on the American Revolution, and it kind of, one of my shticks that I do is I gave a speech in 2018 kind of based off of your episodes, and my big thesis was, and I don't mean to be too grandiose about this, but I compared libertarian podcasters to the pamphleteers of that generation, and I don't know, what do you think about that? Is that kind of too much of a grandiose opinion?
No, actually, and selfishly, I'll take it. I'm happy to be considered in the company of people like Tom Paine. Um, but yeah, that actually makes some sense because if you think about what the pamphlets, what the pamphlets and the pamphleteers were, and I'm sure you probably addressed this, um, that was the medium at the time that had the lowest bar to entry. So, is relatively rudimentary printing presses, cheap ink and paper. It was a lot easier to crank out a few pamphlets than it was to publish a legit regular newspaper, let alone to publish actual books. And so, the bar to entry wasn't quite as low as it is today to start a podcast or to start a blog or a website, but is the easiest thing back then. And, just like today, and even just setting aside um ideology. If you're talking about podcasters in general, YouTubers in general, even bloggers, if you want to be a little bit more old school. Um, Another parallel is, to be honest, a lot of it's not very good, right? This is the same thing with the colonial and revolutionary era pamphlets. Like most of them weren't very good. Most of them were not terribly well written. Most of them were not all that original. A lot of them were full of plagiarism. A lot of them were just, people ranting and whatever. But that's the price you pay to get the gems, right? You need to have the 80% that are pretty much going to be forgotten on the dustbin of history, to get the 20% that are pretty good, and the even smaller percent that are common sense and things like that. Whether my podcast is a common sense of today's pamphlets or whatever, that's in the eye of the beholder. I'll just say that I do my best to make it so. But yeah, I think there's something to that analogy.
Yeah, good. Okay, well, I'm glad you think so. I was reading Bernard Bailyn's work because I took an American legal history class in law school, and one of the assigned texts was Bernard Bailyn's. It was the ideological origins of the American Revolution.
Oh yeah,
And,
yeah, I read that many years ago.
okay, and I thought you might have relied on it a little bit for your episodes. Um,
Yes. Yeah. His work and a handful of others were influential in how I covered some of that stuff for sure.
Yeah. And exactly what you said, and I was kind of looking back through it. It seemed to me like he had said most of the authors of the pamphlets they were like plantation farmers, or they were lawyers or doctors or some kind of politician. But in your understanding, was there also, like, I guess for lack of a better term, average Joes that were writing in pamphlets at the time?
Yeah, there was some of that, and definitely in pamphlets is where you would find more um, stuff written by average Joes than say in serious newspapers or in books or whatever like that. So yeah, it's definitely one of the places where sometimes we do get a window into more of an average guy's perspective, which is always a tricky thing to figure out, especially in eras before you have things like scientific polling uh, of opinions, and even that it's always tricky. There's ways that can be gamed and manipulated and whatever. But yeah, I mean, to look back at, say, 1775 and go, okay, what did the average farmer in such and such an area really think about what was going on? That can be tricky. That can be tricky, and at least some of the time, pamphlets can give you a little bit of a window into that. And then the other tricky part about the pamphlets, though, is that so many of them were written anonymously or under a pseudonym or whatever, and some of those we know who they were, and some of them we don't. Um, so it gets tricky, but for sure, it's one of the best tools that we have to try and reconstruct what the average person had sloshing around in their mind.
Yeah, and you really shattered my understanding of what the American Revolution really was. And maybe it's just because I hadn't worked my way through Conceived in Liberty just yet. I know you can knock that out in an afternoon, but it's just I'm being sarcastic there.
Sure.
Um, um, but yeah, I mean, so growing up in kind of a conservative household, I really worship the founding fathers. But to see you walk us through, and maybe I don't want to be mistaken with what I think your thesis was, but basically the real revolution was fought by average Joes.
Yeah. The conclusion that I eventually, and I came from a mostly pretty, right-wing conservative family as well. And so I definitely was inculcated with a lot of the founding father worship and constitution worship and all that. And, so it wasn't the easiest thing for me to kind of turn away from that or transcend that, or however you might want to put it. But basically what I evolved to was that the revolution was not one thing, and the revolutionaries were not one faction. Even the founding fathers were not one unified faction. That this idea, when and conservatives seem particularly prone to this, to speak about the founding fathers as if they're this one monolithic group that all kind of believe the same things. That's just simply not true. There was a lot of difference between different factions and different individuals, and so just because, broadly speaking, the people on the side of the American Revolution, whether they were the elite leaders or the more rank and file grassroots revolutionaries, they were unified insofar as they wanted to cut the tie to the British Empire, but that doesn't mean they were unified on almost anything else, as far as like, okay, but what's our independence for? And so the way I came to understand it is there were the people who really wanted the revolution to be revolutionary, in the sense of how far can we really push some of these radical ideas about natural rights and everything. And then there was the more conservative revolutionary faction. This is the more kind of George Washington and John Adams and those types of people, where they concluded, at least by the 1770s, they wanted to cut the tie to London politically, but they didn't want to make any significant changes much beyond that to the internal structure and institutions of the country. And so The idea was just, well, we don't want the British elite skimming off the top and occasionally intervening into our local affairs and whatever. But we don't want to make any significant changes much beyond that. And so it's these kind of reluctant revolutionaries and conservative revolutionaries. And yeah, in the early phases of the revolution, the initiative was seized to a large part by grassroots people, the more radical people. And this is what you get when you read a book like American Insurgents, American Patriots by T.H. Breen, and a few others. You get it somewhat in Paul Revere's Ride by Fisher. The book American Spring, I forget the author's name on that one, is another interesting one. But that, particularly when you're looking back around the time period of like Lexington and Concord, these were regular people taking matters into their own hands and leading themselves. And it's only later, after battles are already starting to happen, that the more conservative revolutionaries kind of jump in front of a parade that they didn't start and then pretend like they're leading the parade. And ultimately, though, they do succeed, I think, in largely co-opting it. And so they redirect the revolution ultimately in a less revolutionary way. And in some ways, their kind of crowning achievement is the Constitution itself, is this, kind of thermidor conservative, partial backlash against the more revolutionary aspects of the revolution. And even to some degree, reinstituting aristocracy informally. Right. We never end up getting formal titles of aristocracy and whatever in the United States. But, I think when you look at guys like George Washington, guys like Robert Morris, that they basically wanted to try and, as much as you could in practice, reinstitute something like aristocracy.
And one of the parts that I appreciated most about your series was when you were talking about how you were making kind of an analogy between the radical Islam and people talking about how terrorism is an Islamic thing. And you said, well, this ideology is tied up, this radical, in a way, militant ideology for freedom happened in the United States during the revolution too. So it's not about religion. It's that, it's driven by a political thing that sometimes can get wrapped up in this evangelical religion as its messaging.
Yeah, the relationship between politics and religion is something I've become more and more interested in, even since I did that Revolutionary War series way back whenever it was, 5 or 6 years ago. And especially over the last year or two, I've gotten more and more interested in this idea of politics being religious, in a sense. I did an episode a while back on just introducing the concept of civil religion, which has been around as an idea for a while. And then over the course of the past year or two, I've seen politics in America becoming more and more culty, more and more like a religious conflict. And less of a purely political conflict, to the point where, it's not like we're starting from some of the same basic facts and then just arguing about what they mean, or arguing about, oh, here's this problem we all agree on, and then we just have disagreements about how to address this problem. I've watched politics become more and more where each side is defined by so many assumptions and so many dogmas and things that they might as well not be speaking the same language at all. And yeah, I'm sort of losing my train of thought here, but it's been, watching the woke cult getting more and more off the rails, and then watching especially the really, really Kool-Aid drinking Trump supporters, right? The ones who still think like QAnon is a thing and still think that like Trump's going to be president again if they just do some magical ritual or who knows what. Like, just watching each of those two cults become more and more deranged. And it's just something I'm just sort of grappling with in my own thinking, is trying to wrap my head around what really is going on here. What's the exact mixture of psychology, of theology, of economics, and of politics to really understand this conflict, because I think there's a lot more going on always in these sorts of stories. And I mean, you could bring up the French Revolution, um, bring up the conflicts of the Protestant Reformation, which I did an episode a while ago bringing up some of those parallels. The episode was called something along the lines of a civil religious civil war, and trying to figure out what's really going on here, because I think it's more complicated than most people, even people who I often agree with and that I find to be intelligent intellectuals and commentators. I still think like nobody's quite got it all figured out, and that's one of those things I'm grappling with. And I'm actually in the fairly near future, I'm going to be doing a couple of episodes of my show, talking to a couple of different people about these issues. Be talking to a friend of mine specifically about the book The True Believer by Eric Hoffer, which is a very interesting book. I'm actually reading it for the first time. It's one of these books I've heard about forever, and I've read quotes from and kind of knew the basic idea, but I'm actually reading it cover to cover for the first time right now, and it's very there's a lot there, and I'm going to have another conversation with another friend of mine about some of the parallels between the Great Awakenings in American history, those religious revival movements, and what's going on right now, and whether or not, in a way, we can see all of the wokeism as in part being essentially another Great Awakening, just in a new, stranger form that's different from the previous ones.
There's never enough time, man. And so maybe this is the perfect segue into another topic I wanted to touch on, which was the episodes you've done on the fourth turning, the Strauss-Howe theory. And so for those of the people in the audience who haven't listened to that episode or are unfamiliar with this, can you just kind of describe what that is?
Sure. So I think it's Neil Strauss and William Howe, if I remember their first names correctly. They've written several different books. Only one of them is still alive now, but they've written several different books. The Fourth Turning is probably the best known, and it's the only book of theirs that I've actually read all the way through. But they argue that in American history, and they even trace it back to English history, that there's this pattern that repeats itself where generations are characterized by particular archetypes that repeat themselves in the same order again and again and again. And they break down, they talk about something called the saeculum, which is the idea of thinking about time in terms of a long natural human life. So a person who doesn't die young of some sort of disease or doesn't die of foul play or accident or whatever, who's relatively healthy, probably going to live typically around 80 years or so. Okay. And then breaking that down into parts, into different phases of life. So you've got your childhood phase, which roughly lasts around 20 years. You've got your young adult phase, which is roughly around the next 20 years. Your middle age, which is roughly around the next 20 years of your life. And then your kind of elderhood, which is everything after that. And that these generational archetypes repeat each other in the same order. And they are molded by the experiences of certain events when they're at certain phases of life. So, for example, a big catalyzing event like a Pearl Harbor or 9/11 or, I don't know, the New York stock market crash or the outbreak of the Civil War, some other crisis or catastrophe or whatever, it's going to affect people differently, in part based on where they're at in their life. If you're a little kid, Pearl Harbor is going to seem different than if you're 80 years old when it happens, or you're 40 years old when it happens. And so anyway, the idea is that there are these patterns that keep repeating in the same order, at least most of the time. Occasionally they'll say there's like a little abnormal one or whatever. And this then is reflected by different patterns in the broader social life of the country. And so they say there'll be a period called a high, which is in the aftermath of a crisis. So like, say post-World War II, the 2 decades or so following post-World War II, when a lot of things seem, at least superficially, relatively good. Society seems cohesive, people are optimistic, things seem to be, progressing in the broad sense of the word. And then there'll be an awakening where there's some sort of like spiritual or psychological change that goes on. And so to use one of the more recent cases of this cycle happening to illustrate, so say from like 1945 to maybe 1965, you've got the post-World War II high, right? That's the high. This is, a lot of people are nostalgic for this era because it seems like everything was so good. And then you've got a period of an awakening, which is where there's this sort of like spiritual change. The most recent one of these would be the 1960s kind of counterculture stuff, all that. And then that's followed by an unraveling, which is just where, in general, society seems to be becoming less cohesive, seems to be kind of fraying apart. Institutions are no longer seemingly as stable and strong and capable as they were. Um, there's a lot of like cultural unraveling that happens, and then eventually some sort of a crisis period occurs, and it's not all at once. It's not like one single event. It's usually like there's an initial crisis that begins the crisis era, but then there's either the crisis gets worse or there's an additional crisis that occurs that's even more dramatic. So Strauss and Howe, they say that the last crisis era that happened, they say we're currently in one, by the way, but the last crisis era that happened began with the stock market crash and the Great Depression. But then it intensified with the outbreak of World War II, and the crisis era is not fully resolved in that case until World War II ends, right? So anyway, that cycle keeps repeating itself. Meanwhile, the four archetypes of generations keep repeating themselves in the same order, against this background of the four time periods repeating themselves again and again. I'm sorry, I probably have gone way off the rails as far as details and whatever go, but
No, I think that's awesome, and I really enjoyed that episode that you put out about that. But like a couple follow-up questions to that I've just been thinking about to myself is, earlier I was talking about what my takeaway from your from the American Revolution series was, and I said, well, the thesis is basically that the real revolution was fought by regular average Joes, which I think is an example of how people want to create a narrative around chaotic events. And I guess my question is, do you think that this Strauss-Howe theory is a narrative that was created, not really any backing, but it's trying to put order upon something that is chaotic?
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying, and I think there's always a lot of truth to that way of, not just in regards to, let's see, how would I put this? I did an episode, I think a bit over a year ago, called "What is History?" And I kind of got pretty meta and a little bit more theoretical, I think, than I usually am in that episode. And one of the things I would say is that, to an extent, history is always a narrative that is attempting to simplify and explain something that in reality is so complicated and multifaceted that you really couldn't wrap your head around it, right? So whether you're looking at World War II, whether you're looking at the American Revolution, whether you're looking at the Civil War, whether you're looking at, I don't know, the history in the US of the past decade or two, the thing itself is so complicated and has so many facets and variables to it that there's no way, and the analogy I used a bit in that episode was the idea of the relationship of a map to the territory that the map is depicting. That a map always is going to have a huge number, maybe even an infinite number of simplifications and omissions and other things that allow the map to be useful, right? Because if you actually made a map that was as complicated and held as much information as the actual territory itself, the map would be useless. It would be enormous, right? If you tried to make a map of Florida that had all the information about Florida's geography that exists, the map would be at least as big as the actual, territory, and it would be so complicated that it would be useless. And so in order to make a map, even a very accurate map, there have to be a lot of shortcuts, simplifications, omissions, heuristics, and so forth. And so, yeah, I think any thesis to explain a particular historical event or era or whatever is bound to be, to some extent, artificially simplifying something and streamlining it in order to make it comprehensible. Because, if you were trying to write a book about World War II that actually contained every piece of information about that conflict that exists, it would end up being 20,000 pages and it still wouldn't get it all, right? And so in order to make even like a 500 or 600 page book about World War II, you're making a huge amount of editorial choices to simplify. So yeah, I've on the Strauss-Howe concept, I've got some mixed feelings. Like I definitely feel like there's something to what they're saying. I think there's definitely, and I'm always somebody who's interested in the idea of cyclical time and cyclical history and of finding patterns and rhythms and things like this. I've just always been interested in that way of thinking about history. And I think there's enough to what they're saying that's true that, I don't think it's a crazy a kooky thing like Scientology or something like this, right? But that I always try to remind myself that this is a simplified model. Like they do have to streamline things and shoehorn some things into some boxes where maybe it doesn't always belong. And so I end up with this kind of complicated, ambiguous, nuanced sort of a view where there's definitely something to what they're saying. I think some people take the Strauss-Howe model much too almost like as a fundamentalist, where they're like, oh yes, it's going to play out this exact way.
Yeah,
and they're already like telling you, oh, what we're in right now is going to play out like this, and this person's going to show up, the great champion's going to show up over here, and it's all going to get resolved. And I don't know, my take is more along the lines of, well, I think there's something to what they're saying, and I think it can definitely give us some food for thought about what's really going on. And overall, I have to say, thinking about things in terms of generations, just even setting aside the specifics of the Strauss-Howe model and their specific archetypes and all that, but just the overall idea of generations being an important thing to think about, right? That, we're encouraged currently to think about everything in terms of race and gender and sexuality. We used to think also in terms of class, although that's been largely just completely shouldered aside by race and gender in recent years. But hardly anybody thinks about things in terms of generations. And to me, like each one of these is a tool in the toolbox. Each one of them, I think about that scene in the movie Predator when Predator is adjusting his visor to have different types of views. So like he switches it over and now he's looking at infrared, he switches it again and he's looking at some other form of light or whatever. And to me, like that's ideally how you should be thinking about, oh, I'm going to look at this historical question through the lens of class, or, oh, I'm going to look at this through the lens of race, or, oh, I'm going to look at this through the lens of generations. Like all of those are going to reveal certain things you wouldn't see if you didn't put on those glasses. Like I think, when historians first started to take questions of race and gender and whatever seriously, I think that was a good thing, like to bring in another tool in the toolbox, because yeah, it revealed aspects of history that previously had been hidden, because people were not taking those criteria into account. But it's always a danger if you get locked into one thing, right? You get locked into one lens through which you're looking at things, and you're never even periodically putting the other lenses on to go like, oh, what am I missing over here? But anyway, when I first started to really think about generations as a thing, that was like putting on a new type of lenses and going, oh, look at this. There's a whole bunch of stuff I hadn't seen before here. Because I started to realize, even in my personal interactions, and I'm sure you and everybody listening has had this experience where, like in your work life, which is so different. We all go to school only with people roughly our same age, right? And so, but then we get out into the workplace, and you might have one coworker who's 75 and another coworker who's 19. And you've got to figure out how to get along with these people and communicate with them and whatever. And you realize, like, oh yeah, it's a lot easier when I'm speaking to someone who's within plus or minus, say, 5 years of my age. there's a whole lot less I need to explain, right? There's a whole lot more like, oh yeah, we understand each other. And then you're dealing with someone, many decades older or younger than you, and you realize like, oh, this person, it's sort of like they're speaking a slightly different language than me, and it's not that anyone is better or worse. It's just, if you were born with a smartphone in your hand, basically, the world is a different place than someone who, got a smartphone for the first time when they were 30, or someone who got a smartphone for the first time when they were 60. And the same thing, if you were 10 when 9/11 happened, that's different than if you were 20, and that's different than if you were 60. And that's going to affect how you see the world. Um, so yeah, ultimately my answer on the Strauss-Howe generational theory is I think there's something there. I think generations are a worthwhile thing to keep in mind and sort of an analytical tool to have in your toolbox. I think though there's the danger of becoming a kind of literalist or fundamentalist about it, and ultimately maybe falling victim to the map territory fallacy, and thinking like, oh, this model actually is the thing, rather than, oh, this is a simplified, heuristic that's there to help understand certain things, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. And I have a buddy who he started substitute teaching elementary school kids. And he came to me and he's like, "Patrick, man, like there's such a generational difference between these older teachers who are in their 50s and 60s and these kids who are like, 8 to 10 or 12, because these kids were all raised on YouTube. And so all of their just the way they interact with each other, their humor is weird and off the wall and spontaneous, and it all consists of inside like internet jokes. And so but it's so true. And
Yeah, I've had an interesting experience teaching college history for 15 years, because when I started, I was only about 25 or so. And so I was at most a half generation older than my students in my early years. I mean, I was 24, 25, they were 18, 19. And so in my earliest years of teaching, I didn't feel a whole lot different from them. Um, all kinds of like my little inside jokes and whatever they would get. I'd make some reference to some movie from the 80s or 90s or whatever, and like they all knew what I was talking about. And they were not, um, they got the internet and cell phones basically when they were just a few years younger than I was when I got those things. And then as time has gone on, I'm going to turn 40 in September, and the students are still 18, 19 years old, most of them anyway. And it's a different thing. I have to, and it applies to certain historical topics too. I have to like explain 9/11 more. Whereas when I first started teaching in 2006, like I didn't have to explain to anybody just like the basics of 9/11. Even
that's
the Cold War.
strange concept. Sorry.
Yeah. Even the Cold War. Even the Cold War, when I started teaching, these kids had been born as the Cold War was winding down, but they still sort of got it, right? They still sort of got like the after effects. There's still, there were enough movies and things still around that had the Cold War as a backdrop or as the kind of foreground. But now it's like I have to start off with, okay, what's NATO? Let's explain what the Warsaw Pact even means, right? Let's talk about, like all the lingo of the Cold War, just to use that as an example, that I previously could take for granted. That I could talk about the bipolar world and superpowers and mutually assured destruction, and all the different little lingo of the Cold War. Now I've got to like go through that as if I'm introducing a foreign language. I've got to say like, okay, here's what, these terms mean. Um, and so, yeah, I guess in part what happens as I'm closing in on 40 is you start to realize like, oh yeah, I'm not hip anymore, you know, and but becoming okay with that though, because there's nothing worse than a person who's, in their 40s or 50s or whatever, and like really is still in their mind like, oh yeah, I'm still 20, like that's just kind of sad, right? Like you see the old guy at the concert who's just like not, I think there's a way to age gracefully,
Yeah.
where you stay plugged in enough to what's hip that you kind of know what's going on, but you also don't pretend that you're young and cool anymore. You're just like,
Yeah.
no, it's their turn now, let them do their thing, and I think it helps too to have kids, um to kind of keep you sane and acting your age to a certain extent.
Yeah, and I'm just personally I'm kind of looking forward to that because like I like to think I'm cool. I mean, I'm really into heavy metal and stuff, and so when my kids get to be teenage years, I'm trying to craft exactly how I'm going to not push it on them, but still have them find it themselves. Or like Liberty too, you know.
Yeah. It's a balancing act, right? Because my kids are a little bit older now. One of them's a teenager. One of them's about to be a teenager, and it's a very fine line, like you were saying, with everything from ideology to just like what movies you like and what music you like and whatever, where you don't want to try to like make your kids your own little cult where you're just like, all right, you're going to listen to the same crap I do, whether you like it or not. But at the same time, you do want to offer it to them. You do want to kind of share, some of your stuff with them, especially if it's stuff they're unlikely to encounter otherwise, right? I mean, like, how likely are my kids to encounter like good classic rock on their own? Like
Yeah.
maybe. I mean, people still listen to Led Zeppelin and Jimi Hendrix and whatever. At the same time, you can't count on it because there's probably plenty of 10, 15-year-olds today who have never heard any of that stuff. So, and I've found with my own kids, partly that just by spending a lot of time with them and having a good relationship with them, they're interested in my stuff without me having to like shove it at them. And in particular, like they like a lot of my old music and movies and whatever. They'll ask me like, "Oh, are there any '80s movies we haven't seen yet?" That kind of stuff. They'll play vintage video games with me. So
Yeah. I can't imagine a world where that stuff's not cool, but anyway, well, I'll digress, but my thing with the Strauss-Howe theory is, and I've seen this come around because we're in a way we're kind of coming full circle, and I've been doing some work trying to write an article for the Libertarian Institute about how we've American foreign policy has consciously returned to what they call renewed great power competition. And I'm seeing so many echoes of this World War One, this pre-World War One kind of state, but also harkening back to the Cold War too. My thing is that I worry that these concepts become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And where I came up with this is I was watching Tim Pool, and I've critiqued him a lot lately. This is an aside point, but the Uyghur genocide issue where he's claiming this is happening in China, my listeners will be sick of hearing me talk about it, but it's not as a sure thing as he says it is. But he's been using this Strauss-Howe theory to gin up, I believe, some kind of the inevitability of a great war between the United States and Russia and China, and that the Uyghur genocide thing is just a block in the whole structure. But so, do you worry about that, or do you have any thoughts about that?
yeah. Uh, okay. So first thing, I stopped following Tim Pool,
Yeah,
honestly, because it seemed like he's always pushing the fear real hard. Like every headline is all caps. Every
right,
headline is as sensational as possible. And I understand why he does it from like an economic point of view. Like that's how you get clicks, that's how you get views, whatever. But I can only consume so much, the end of the world is tomorrow type
right.
stuff before I'm like, I can't, like, just in terms of mental health and whatever, I've got to unplug from that sort of stuff. Um, yeah, I definitely worry about a potential like serious old school war, a great power war, not one of these proxy wars or wars of occupation in some third world country or whatever. Yeah, I'm concerned about that. I also am always leery anytime there's a big narrative about some other country's government doing something horrible. Not that I don't believe that they do, right? Like
Right.
I'm no fan of the Chinese Communist Party, and I have no doubt they do awful shit all the time, and their history is not so great. I'm familiar with Mao and everything like that, and so on the one hand, like, yeah, fine, if you want to put a spotlight on some of the worst aspects of some of those regimes, I don't necessarily have a problem with that in and of itself. But yeah, I'm always leery. Wait, who's pushing this and why, right? Like if suddenly a bunch of neocons are pushing, oh, look what China's doing, to oppress these people over here, they're not just bringing, or, hey, look at this nasty thing North Korea's doing or whatever. Those sorts of people aren't putting a spotlight on that because they just care about the human rights and just want to ameliorate the situation. They're doing it because they want to stoke conflict. And so that always becomes tricky. Same thing when some right-wing nationalist war hawk or whatever is bringing up something terrible happening in Venezuela or whatever, or Iran. It's always, yeah, but why are you bringing that up specifically? You're probably bringing it up in order to justify some sort of intervention, and I'm not going along with you on that one. Um, so yeah, and there definitely is this idea of, you mentioned it before, and I think it's appropriate, self-fulfilling prophecy. There's definitely a lot of that when you look back at say the origins of World War One, where you know European leaders, both political but also kind of intellectual leaders, writers, even fiction authors, for at least a couple decades before World War One, were increasingly pushing this idea that great power war, between the Triple Entente and the Central Powers was inevitable. And I don't think it actually was inevitable, but I think that if you can get enough people to believe something's inevitable, it ultimately does become inevitable. Um, so yeah, I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned about Biden, and is he asleep at the wheel? And to what extent? What are those around him up to? And I don't trust any of those people to be willing to pull back from the brink should something happen, right? Should there be some ridiculous incident with the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea, some crappy coral reef atoll somewhere, there's a little Gulf of Tonkin incident or some little shootout or whatever. I don't trust the people in charge to keep things in perspective and say, well, is that really worth risking World War III over? In the same way, for all their flaws, I look back to some of the guys in charge during the Cold War, and for all their flaws, somebody like Dwight Eisenhower, I don't see him, going to World War III over some little atolls in the South China Sea. I just don't. And I'd be willing to trust him with the keys to the empire right now, just to keep a cool head on that sort of stuff. Now, with Eisenhower, he also unleashed the Dulles brothers to go crazy in the Third World, overthrowing governments and whatever. So I'm not saying I'm a fan of everything he did, but at least at the level of like great power conflict, somebody like Eisenhower, I would trust to keep a level head and to keep things in perspective. Whereas the current generation, and this in a way cycles back to the Strauss-Howe thing, right? Because one of the things is that the people who are adults when a crisis era happens are somewhat chastened by it, and it makes them a little bit more cautious. And so if you look back at the Cold War, most of the leaders of both the US and the Soviet Union during the entire Cold War were guys who had been at least young adults, if not older, when World War II happened. And so because of that, they got more of the full kind of view of what World War II really was. And so this then made them at least somewhat more cautious about World War III than they otherwise would have been, right? So Eisenhower or Kennedy or even Nixon, for all of his flaws and all the horrible stuff he did, ultimately he didn't go off to World War III. Whereas our current generation of leaders, it's overwhelmingly baby boomers. And by definition, these are people who were born after World War II. They were born in its aftermath during the high. And so they were not alive and adults when World War II happened. I think I've a few times said World War I instead of World War II when I meant it. So hopefully, I meant to say World War II. So hopefully the listeners will get what I'm saying, right? But anyway, because the boomers were born in the aftermath of World War II, their version of World War II is very whitewashed, rose-colored glasses, rah, rah, rah for team freedom kind of stuff. And so they have this rosy image of what World War II was, which means they're not nearly as cautious and reluctant about potentially unleashing World War III than the GI generation would have been, right? And so Strauss and Howe say that one of the reasons why really, really big wars seem to only happen about once every 80 to 100 years is because you need the generation of the previous war to die off, because they are the restraining influence um, on their governments. And yeah, so the GI generation, the World War II generation, they're basically gone. You know, a few of them are around 100 years old or whatever, but they're no longer running anything. And it's overwhelmingly the boomers, right? Like all of our presidents, basically, since George H.W. Bush, have all been boomers. And you know, look at the leaders of the parties in Congress and all these things. They're overwhelmingly boomers. And so, you know, as a generation, I don't think we should trust them as much as we maybe would have trusted earlier generations to step back from the brink, right? The way Kennedy did with the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example. I don't trust them, you know, and equally in this regard, whether it's, you know, Trump or Biden or whatever, I just don't trust any of them to keep a cool head and not be kind of swept along in the game theory of it all, right? Because if you get tunnel visioned, if you get tunnel visioned into the particular kind of like tit for tat of some escalating international crisis, it's very easy to lose perspective and lose the bigger picture and go like, yeah, but is it really worth risking hundreds of millions of deaths over some crummy, you know, island somewhere that no one cares about? Um, it's a matter of keeping things in perspective. And you know, who knows with the current, and I admit I've not been following it super closely, so but the current, you know, explosion in Israel right now, like, could that get out of hand and turn into a regional conflict that then snowballs um, beyond that, right, into a proxy war or something even worse, right, with Russia and or China backing certain parties and the U.S. and Israel backing other parties. And you know, one of the things you realize when you read into the details of the outbreak of World War One is that the different um, monarchs and prime ministers and whatnot at the start of the war, they really thought they had things under control. They really thought, oh yeah, don't worry, this will be, you know, a fairly short, decisive conflict. It'll be over in a matter of months. It'll be like the Franco-Prussian War or something like that. It'll be relatively quick and easy, and that'll be that. And turns out, no, it's going to be the biggest war in human history up to that point. It's going to result in millions of people dead, millions more maimed. And it's also going to spell the end of most of those old regimes in Europe, right? I mean, would the Tsar and the Kaiser and the Austrian Emperor and all these people, would they have been so blasé about going to war in 1914 if they knew it was going to lead to the end of their regime, and in some cases, the end of their dynasty's lives, right? In the case of the Tsar. Or would they have suddenly, you know, said, hey, let's try and see if we can diffuse the situation and maybe we can work out a diplomatic solution and give peace a chance, right? There's this arrogance of leaders that it seems to me like the current generation of American leaders have this arrogance that's very similar to European leaders on the eve of World War One. This arrogance that, don't worry, we've got everything under control. Not understanding that war is this Pandora's box, that once you open it, you don't get to control where it goes from there. You know, it's very easy for some archduke getting killed by some Serbians to turn into Scotsmen trying to kill Germans in northern France, you know, in a matter of weeks.
And equally, I worry about the potential for an accident. I think, like, in some way, I think that's a little more likely to happen, is that, you know, we keep doing these elephant walks and we keep, you know, pushing American naval vessels into the Black Sea, or sailing through what is it, the Taiwanese Strait, or, you know, confronting cutters, the U.S. Coast Guard confronting Iranian cutters in the Strait of Hormuz, you know, and or you know, some incident kicks off and like you said, tit for tat, or just some kind of an accident, and then all of a sudden, boom, we've been ramping things up for so far and so long that it just tips off.
Yeah, and that's what's so insane. When you go study the Cold War and how many times, like what you were saying, almost kicked off World War III,
Right.
right? Not even just some stupid crisis escalating out of hand, but yeah, accidents, mistakes, right? I mean, the most charitable interpretation of the Gulf of Tonkin incident is it was a misapprehension of what was really happening, a misreading of the radar and a few other things, right? That the most charitable interpretation is just they misunderstood what was happening, and then by the time they kind of realized what had really happened, the political decisions had already been made to escalate. And it to me, looking at the Cold War, it's an absolute miracle that the world made it through almost 50 years of Cold War, much of the time, with lots of nuclear weapons in the mix, and how many times it almost went full nuclear over some stupid little, oh, the radar malfunctioned, or oh, a flock of geese flew in front of the radar, or oops, we almost accidentally hit the wrong button and nuked some island somewhere, or there was that one incident where it almost happened way more times than people realize, because many of these incidents were not revealed to the public until decades after the fact, right? I mean, everybody knew about the Cuban Missile Crisis in real time, but how many other times it almost happened that everybody was just unaware of, other than a handful of people? And how often nuclear Armageddon was averted simply because some mid-level officer, in many cases, broke the rules, didn't do what the manual said, and said, whoa, 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 whoa. Yeah, I know the manual says we're supposed to launch the nukes when we get this type of radar reading, but I think there might be a malfunction, and let's go ahead and not do what we're supposed to do and launch the nukes, whatever like that. There was that one incident that has been revealed, and I would guess there's been more of these that we'll never know about, including some behind the Iron Curtain. But there was an incident where an American Air Force bomber was carrying nuclear weapons over the U.S. and accidentally dropped one. And it's been long enough since I read up on this, and I eventually might do some coverage of some of these because it's just insane. But it was something along the lines of, I want to say it was over North Carolina, but I could be wrong about exactly where. But an American bomber accidentally dropped a real live nuclear weapon on American territory, and it was like fully armed and ready to go. And I think the only reason it didn't blow up was that the detonator itself actually malfunctioned, something ridiculous like that. Like the only thing that saved America from nuking itself was that particular nuke didn't quite work right. Right. I mean, this is far beyond, far beyond like Stanley Kubrick craziness here. This is going beyond Dr. Strangelove insanity. And now think about this. Suppose when the American bomber accidentally dropped this nuke on an American state, suppose the bomb had lit off. What would have happened after that? Like, would the American president and military brass and whatever, would they have actually said, whoa, we think this might have been a horrific accident. We think we might have actually bombed our own people. And you know what? Before we do anything drastic, we need to take a step back and do a thorough investigation and really find out what happened here. Or for one reason or another, would they decide, all right, it's time let's go ahead and pin this on the Russians or whoever, and let's go ahead and go to war, because you know what? That alternative is better for us than telling the truth to the American people that we're not competent. We're not competent to safely keep these toys from going off. Better to blame it on some foreigners rather than have the American people's wrath directed at us for screwing this up and maybe nuking an American city or something like that, right? It's very easy. I mean, all you got to do is look back at the USS Maine blowing up and how that was handled by the people in the press and the government that wanted the war, right? It was, oh, we know the Spanish did that, right? Even though it made no sense, and there were experts at the time saying that that's not what happened, and but people like Teddy Roosevelt and people like the pro-war parts of the press, they were just like, nah, we don't need to investigate. The Spanish did it, obviously. Let's go to war. And that ended up being not that bloody and big of a war, but imagine like the nuclear equivalent of the USS Maine. Either a false flag or just again, most charitable explanation of the USS Maine is it was a tragic accident based on faulty ship design. But how quick would they be to and the same thing for the other side too, right? I mean, I focus more on the US government because they're, allegedly represent me. Um, and I live on their tax form, but I certainly don't think that the Soviet government or the current Russian or Chinese regimes are angels either. And, might they accidentally drop a nuke on one of their cities or who knows what, and then blame it on either the US or some other enemy they have, or yeah, yeah, these things can escalate so fast. And the technology is there that they can escalate a lot faster than they did 100 years ago with World War One. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely something I worry about. Um, and I cross my fingers that there's still enough decent, reasonable people in kind of the mid-level bureaucracy and like mid-level officers in some of these military units that deal with these sorts of things. I hope that they would still kind of take a step back and go, well, let's just double check the radar first or whatever. But I don't know. I don't know. And there so much of this stuff is secrecy, right? So many of these things either we never find out about or we find out 60 years after the fact when no one cares. Um, so yeah, it's very murky. It's very murky.
In a way, it's kind of, I don't know, it's crazy and insane that that life can go on as normal in blissful ignorance. I mean, it's yeah.
Yeah. When I talk about with my students, talk about the Cold War and talk about some of these incidents where it almost went nuclear and things like this. Um, One of the things I bring up is, yes, there has been some significant reduction in nuclear arsenals since the end of the Cold War, but still, the U.S. and Russian governments each have thousands of thermonuclear weapons, and the Chinese have some at least in the hundreds, as far as I understand. And then a handful of other countries have various amounts of nuclear weapons. Um, you wouldn't know it based on the way our politicians and press talk about things. Like, they very flippantly talk about like, oh, let's to hop back a few years, when Hillary Clinton and people like that were saying, oh, let's impose a no-fly zone on Syria.
Right.
Like, no, not even a nod to the fact of, well, you know what that means? That means we'd have to start shooting down Russian planes flying in that area that are invited by the Syrian government if you do this, right? And do you think the Russians are just gonna like roll over and be cool with that, or do you think they could respond? And I don't know. I don't know how. And Scott Horton is always great at bringing this up every chance he gets. That how could it not go nuclear? If the US got into a direct war with either Russia or China or both, how could it not eventually go nuclear, regardless of everybody's intentions at the beginning? Like, just the game theory aspect of it, don't you think whoever starts to lose first is gonna go nuclear? And even if they initially are doing it in a restrained fashion and maybe only using tactical battlefield nukes or, oh, we're only going to hit a few targets just to make a point or whatever, like, yeah, okay, but then what's the other side going to do? Right? Is everybody just going to keep like keeping a lid on like, oh, don't worry, they only took out one of our cities, so we're only going to take out one of theirs and then call it a day, right? Um, they talk about great power wars as if nukes weren't a thing, but they are. And so it's this bizarre sword of Damocles situation where we're all eating our dinner under this giant sword dangling over us, and the politicians and media are like, "There's no sword, there's nothing there. Just chow down, just go about your day." It's like it's a tricky thing too from an individual mental health standpoint, right? Because if I sit here all day just thinking about that the end of the world technically could still happen, if some stupid political dispute somewhere gets out of hand and it goes nuclear, like that's a great way to spend all day being fearful and depressed and whatever, and that's gonna ruin your ability to live a happy life. And probably the world's not going to end tomorrow. Probably the world's not going to end next week. None of these things are super likely to happen, but they're all possible. And so to me at least, it's always a struggle, like as an individual grappling with these things. And in general, this happens to me a lot dealing with some of the darker historical topics that I've dealt with. On the one hand, this is really important stuff that I think more people really need to know about, whether it's the possibility of nuclear war, whether it's something like, for example, the history of the U.S. government doing medical experiments on unwilling human test subjects under various guises. Like this is not fun stuff to cover. I sometimes get depressed, honestly, researching some of the things that I research, but on the other hand, it's like really important to know. And some of the most important things to come to grips with in history are some of the things that are honestly the most kind of depressing, and so I continuously struggle for the sort of balance there, as far as just personally my own coverage. I've dialed back my own news coverage for sure a lot. I don't consume anywhere near as much news as I used to. And that's partly for my own psychological well-being. In particular, just a tip for anybody listening who finds themselves frequently becoming angry and depressed at following current events. Just one thing that's done a lot to help me out psychologically is I don't consume news early in the morning, and I don't consume news in the evening. Whatever news consumption I do is middle of the day, because I found if I watch or read a lot of news either first thing in the morning or else in the evening when I'm like getting ready for bed or whatever, it's bad. It's bad. If I read a bunch of depressing news first thing in the morning while I'm eating breakfast, ruins the tone of my day. And if I'm doing it right before I'm going to sleep, it's going to ruin my ability to relax and have a good sleep and, connect with my family and whatever like that. So yeah, in the morning, it's mostly kind of up tempo music is what
Yeah.
I'm doing.
Yeah.
And then in the evening, it's, watching things that are more kind of like lighthearted and, even if it's a horror movie or whatever, it's something that's not too realistic and depressing. So, and it's been even harder for me, honestly, over the last year as the COVID insanity has also been damaging my mental health as it has been.
Yeah.
I'm sure virtually everybody other than some politicians and pharmaceutical CEOs.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, it's been rough, and well, I'm glad that you're coming back to the show, and that we got through this year. Things seem to be lightening up quite a bit, but I totally I'm right there with you. And when especially with the Israeli-Palestine issue, and knowing about Yemen, and like I put on Killing Gaza, the documentary, the other night, and my wife like saw the first shot of like a young toddler dying in his father's arms, and she's like, nope, why do you put this on, Patrick? Like, I'm out of here. And I'm just like, I don't know, it's important. Like it is important, and we got to do what we can about it, especially given that we are enabling it, at least the American government is, and the taxpayers, and Yemen and stuff like that. But at the same time, I wonder why children are just born to die. I think about that a lot. And I also, yeah, it's rough. It is.
Yeah, yeah. It slows me down, honestly, in terms of my work, because so many of the topics I cover are things that are infuriating or depressing or both or some other mixture of negative emotions. But I I sort of sometimes feel like a doctor in that, the best doctor is the one who tells you the truth, even when the truth is not good, right? If you've got some type of horrible cancer, you want the doctor who's not going to BS you, who's going to tell you what's really going on and,
Yeah.
give you your options. You don't want the doctor who's going to say, well, this guy's got this horrible cancer and there's only this one risky long shot treatment that might work. But even if it does work, it's not going to be fun. Man, I don't want to ruin this guy's day. I don't want to ruin his whole week. You know what? I'm just gonna switch these X-rays over here and tell him, yeah, you're good. Um, I'd rather be the good doctor. I think the doctor is your friend who tells you the bad news, but it slows me down. I can remember many times working on different episodes for my podcast where, I mean, first off, one of the things I learned pretty quickly in doing my podcast is everything always takes way longer to do than I think it's going to. Every time I'm like, I've stopped giving time estimates on anything anymore.
Yes.
To listeners.
I need to learn that.
Yeah. No, and it took me a while. I should have stopped doing that sooner than I did. But I'd be like, oh yeah, pretty sure I'm going to knock this series out over the next 2 weeks. And it's like, no, it's going to take 2 years. So everything takes longer than it should. But one of the reasons, it's not the only one, but one of the reasons why things will often take me longer than I expect is that when I'm covering a topic that's particularly dark or what have you, like it slows me down. I remember one of the first times I really noticed this was when I did an episode a while ago on the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that the research and composition for that episode took me longer than I really thought it was going to. And I realized it was because it was just it was just wearing at me psychologically. When you really dig into the details of that, like I can remember I hadn't looked into the specific details before that episode of like where exactly in the city did that bomb hit, right? Like,
yeah.
And who were the first people who got just incinerated, right? And then you find out, oh, it's horrible. It's like, oh yeah, one of the bombs, I forget which one, actually like landed right on or right next to one of the main hospitals for the city. And it's like, oh, okay, great. So, a whole bunch of sick and injured people who are just randomly in the hospital that day are going to get obliterated. Also, it means that there goes the biggest hospital in the city for treating people in the aftermath. Great, Or, here's an anecdote by a survivor who, when the bomb fell, he was a 6-year-old kindergarten student walking to the bus stop when the A-bomb fell on his neighborhood and, got horribly burned and lived, but his whole family died. And, he got up that morning like, oh, I'm going to go to school. And then boom, an A-bomb falls on your neighborhood, right? It's like,
yeah,
this is, and seeing some of the photos of what people and things look like in the aftermath of those A-bombs, right? And, things like that. Where again, it's this difficult balance where I think it's really important to share these disturbing truths or current events of like what's going on in Yemen, like you were saying. I don't know. There's a tricky balancing act there, where if people don't know about these things, then how can you ever maybe have even a chance at stopping them, right? But I mean, even as the messenger, it's tough. It's tough, and you feel like you're sort of taking one for the team in a way, and then relatively few people appreciate that. There's your fans and supporters, and I'm very thankful for all of mine. Who kind of understand like, oh yeah, you are sort of taking one for the team by staring into the abyss. So that I don't have to. Yeah.
I was just gonna say that yeah, the Nietzsche reference, right?
Yep.
That's yeah, and. A little bit of a white pill though, because I think we should wrap things up. Although I really enjoy this conversation. I wish we could do it for a few more hours. But
well, did you want to get into World War I propaganda at all, or did you want to maybe set that aside for another time? Or
well, let's do it. Well, I got you on the horn. But a white pill though. Is Michael Malice's book about anarchism is trending really high on Amazon Books right now.
Oh yeah, I heard about that.
So, yeah, but so going into the World War I stuff though, let's this is what made me think about it. I was doing some research, and I was getting into kind of the war propaganda stuff and the Chinese Uyghur genocide issue. There's so many parallels in World War I. I was thinking about, COVID vaccine passports and vaccine mandates and making a parallel between the conscientious objectors in Britain during World War I, specifically in Britain, and all the propaganda campaigns. And I happened upon this gem. Like you can't make this up. Is the propaganda. Some artist from the United States was reimagining World War I posters as modern day call for Americans to wear face masks. And it made me think about, those propaganda campaigns back then, but how much more sophisticated that it's become in this kind of, I don't know, this dark meta overlay where history kind of repeats itself in that, you know, if people were alive today and they saw World War I propaganda, they would kind of scoff at how rudimentary it was and how they'd be like, oh, I wouldn't fall for that, you know. But now it's, I don't know, it's kind of become meta to the point where it's parodying itself.
Yeah. Well, and they've the people who are in the propaganda business, who of course, typically won't call themselves that, they definitely have a lot more media that they can use, like a lot more variety of media, right? I mean, in World War One, radio was still pretty new. Motion pictures were still pretty new, and so those were still pretty rudimentary by our standards today. And a lot of things that exist today that can be used for propaganda purposes just flat out weren't invented yet, right? So I think television existed, but it was hardly anyone had one, so it wasn't really viable for propaganda. Trying to remember, maybe television didn't exist. I forget when television was first developed, but it didn't become widespread for a while until after it was developed. Maybe it was developed a little bit later. I think television existed for sure by World War II, but hardly anyone had one. But so, today we've got television, we've got internet, we've got all these other things that people could have never even fantasized about that can be used for propaganda purposes. So that makes it more sophisticated today. And then another thing is that the people in that line themselves, the people in sort of the PR realm, for the state, either directly or indirectly, they've had that many more years and generations to refine their craft. You go read things written by people like George Creel and Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann in the early to mid 20th century, and you realize like they were figuring this stuff out for the first time. A lot of these concepts of like how to really, particularly in a country like the United States, where if you did propaganda in the United States the same way that like the classic totalitarian and authoritarian regimes did, it probably wouldn't work. The propaganda has to be crafted to the kind of character and mores of the people that you're trying to propagandize. And so American propaganda always had to be slicker and more subtle and less obvious. And American propaganda has always had also a pretty high degree of bottom-up propaganda and horizontal propaganda in addition to top-down, right? And so this gives more at the superficial level. It looks like it's not this centrally controlled authoritarian thing, the way like Soviet propaganda to our eyes seems obvious, right? American propaganda, and to some extent this was learned by American propagandists from the British, which, anyone who studies World War I propaganda, you pretty quickly realize that the British were the top dogs of propaganda in World War I. Like all World War I propaganda historians will pretty much agree that the British were the best at it. They did it the most, they did it the best in World War I. And American propagandists very consciously and deliberately learned from them, and in some cases communicated with them and were directly influenced by them. And so, when you're looking back at the American propaganda in World War I, first thing to keep in mind is America was the target of propaganda from the British first. Before the U.S. got into the war. And the British propaganda operation in the U.S. in World War I, before American entry, was extensive. They had a whole, and this is something I'm still researching to eventually do some coverage on, but the British had a very, very large, well-funded, and sophisticated propaganda operation in the U.S. from 1914 to 1917, when the U.S. finally got in the war, that was very much aimed at both public opinion as well as elite opinion, to gradually bring them about to being anti-German, pro-British, pro-ally, and eventually to actively want to get into the conflict. And by contrast, the Germans tried to do some propaganda in the U.S., but their efforts were just nowhere near as big or as effective. And part of this was they didn't devote as many resources to it as the British did. And part of it is simply there was no way they were going to be able to match the Germans for propaganda effectiveness in America, simply because the British already have the language and have more of a cultural affinity, particularly with America's elites back then, than would the Germans. And so this gave the British a huge advantage. And then, to be fair, they also were just better at it than the Germans were. And so the British started to understand this idea that the best propaganda is that which does not appear to be propaganda to most people. And also that propaganda is more effective if it appears to be not coming out of like one central place, but appears to be more kind of like spontaneous and bottom up and all that. And so the British employed a lot of those principles in their own propaganda. And then when the U.S. got into the war, of course, Woodrow Wilson establishes the Committee on Public Information, which is like super Orwellian sounding, puts this muckraking progressive huckster journalist, George Creel, in charge of it. And they go wild. They create all kinds of everything from pamphlets to films. They had the so-called 4-minute men who were trained to give little short 4-minute rah rah rah, whipping people up war speeches all around the country, and it was centrally controlled, but was also to some degree bottom up, and at least had the appearance of decentralization. So you'd go to like the movie theater in Nebraska during the war, and in addition to seeing some propaganda film strips interspersed in between the features, and the features themselves might also be propaganda war movies too. Also, some local notable from your town, the local bank president or somebody, the local president of the Kiwanis Club or something, comes and gives you a 4-minute war speech, to rally you and encourage the young men to go enlist and whatever. And so it was quite pervasive. And also, they did both sides of the coin in that to really have effective propaganda, you need to get your narrative out there as all pervasively as you can, and preferably have as much of your propaganda as possible be stuff that's slick and doesn't appear to be propaganda to most people. But also you have to silence competing narratives. And the Wilson administration did that too. Wilson actually, in his speech going to war in April 1917, he actually addressed internal dissent explicitly. And there was a line in the speech where he said something like, if there is any disloyalty, it will be dealt with the firm hand of repression. That's in his speech. The president is saying, I'm going to repress disloyalty. And by disloyalty, he doesn't just mean like active, German agents and saboteurs and traitors. He means people who are just like conscientious objectors and things like this as well. And so this is where infamously he gets past and uses the Espionage and Sedition Acts to go after even, peaceful, nonviolent, conscientious objectors and things like this, to throw Eugene Debs in jail for giving a speech telling America's boys that they maybe shouldn't allow themselves to be conscripted into the war effort. There's all sorts of horrific cases that happen where, people get locked in prison. Thousands of Americans go to prison for things they say and things they write during the war. But then also, this then inspires vigilantism as well. And so individuals and groups throughout America who were not part of the state take matters into their own hands, and sometimes do horrific things, and sometimes to people who are completely innocent of even the government's definition of disloyalty. Oftentimes it's just something ridiculous, like somebody says good morning to their neighbor in a German neighborhood in an American city, and they say good morning in German, right? And this is a time when lots of Americans were still first-generation German immigrants. And then, some patriotic Captain America vigilante hears this and is like, oh no, that guy's a German spy. And next thing you know, someone's getting beaten or even lynched in a few cases. And so there's some parallels there with COVID where there's the propaganda narrative, there's the attempt to suppress alternative narratives, there's the state sometimes intervening, although less so in the case of COVID, direct state intervention at censorship and things like this, but that there's people taking matters into their own hands in some cases, right? There's the mask vigilantes and things like this that'll go out there and harass people for not, being wearing their mask outside alone or whatever. Um, but then there's also private entities indirectly acting on behalf of the state. So, in the case of COVID, right, we see social media companies and things like this sort of taking matters into their own hands and like indirectly acting in ways that the state would agree with, but they're not the state, right? And so they get this sort of cover for doing so. And there was some of this that happened in World War I as well. One of the most interesting is this group that when I do cover this stuff in greater detail on some episodes of my show, I'm going to talk about. There was this group created during World War I that's very interesting called the American Protective League, which technically speaking was not a state agency. It was a private volunteer group set up initially by some very kind of like pro-war businessmen and people like that. But then it has this kind of like sort of semi-adoption by the state where actual state agencies started to work with them as like auxiliaries unofficially. And it's this weird thing where like the American Protective League had no legal authority to do things, but they did it anyway. Like they made their own little fake badges that technically were not issued by any government agency, and they would go and like search people's stuff and like detain people and whatever.
Really?
And essentially they were bluffing. They had no legal authority to do what they were doing, but they did it anyway. And enough people were like, oh, gee whiz, this sounds official. Let me do what he says. But the American Protective League, it was connected to the government in various ways, including this very interesting character named Ralph Van Diemen, Van Diemen, I'm not sure exactly how to put the emphasis on the syllables there, but who is considered the father of U.S. military intelligence, who had initially made a career for himself as America's top military intelligence guy in the Philippines in the early 20th century. And then during World War I, he operates in the United States. And he's one of the connectors between the actual U.S. government and organizations like the American Protective League, who take matters into their own hands. And so there's some interesting parallels there where, we didn't have anything quite like the APL for COVID, but we definitely had, some kind of like self-appointed private groups and individuals and things who were, kind of like vigilantes on behalf of the state almost. And there's infinite parallels too we could go through as far as like paranoia and encouraging people to see the threat as being way more than what it is, right? I mean, the media acted as if COVID was killing half the people who contracted it or something like this, the way they were reacting, all out of proportion to the actual statistics and numbers. And the same thing in World War I, in the case of a lot of the propaganda focused on alleged fears of German spies and saboteurs and things like this. And if you go back and look at what actually there was as far as that stuff, like, yeah, that did exist. There were, occasional German spies or saboteurs or whatever who were caught. But, sort of like Al Qaeda in the aftermath of 9/11, the threat was nowhere near what it was made out to be in actual reality, right? But they're very happy to amp up the fear as much as they can in order to grab maximum power, right, over the citizenry in order to justify and legitimize anything they want to do, and also, again, to inspire horizontal enforcement. I think in both cases there's a heavy reliance on horizontal enforcement to actually do the dirty work.
And I didn't see anything like this in the United States, or at least personally from me. But in World War I, they had this the campaign with the poppies. So in Britain they would go up to, if there was military age men on the street in Britain, the women would go up and pin, was it a poppy or a flower or something, on their lapel. And that was a way for them to call out people who weren't part of the armed service or weren't off fighting. And it actually became so effective that the government actually had to stop women from doing it they gave out another badge that if you were not in the military, but you were part of the war effort, you would have to wear that around to get women to not come up to you and publicly humiliate you about being part of the war effort.
Yeah. The idea was if you were an able-bodied military-age male who wasn't in uniform, you must be a shirker or a draft dodger or whatever it is.
A Conchi or some, yeah.
Yeah, that too. And
Well, you were probably
whereas,
in prison.
yeah, in some cases, it might just be that like you worked in a very valuable war-related job, and so you were actually exempt from military service, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah. It's always interesting to watch when governments create these sort of horizontal enforcement dynamics where sometimes it gets out of hand and becomes even counterproductive to what the government is trying to do, and then they end up having to like try and rein in the vigilantes and the private volunteer auxiliaries and whatever. Yeah, that's always interesting to watch. And also, it's always interesting to watch when all that hysteria is whipped up about a particular crisis. When the crisis does end, there's certain true believers who don't want to let it go,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And so right now you see this where the CDC finally said like, oh yeah, you can not wear a mask if you're vaccinated and whatever. And there's been a chorus of mostly establishment progressives who are like, no, no, the same people who are like, you should always mindlessly do whatever the CDC says
Right.
without question. Now the CDC is actually saying, hey, we're going to relax some of this stuff. And some of these people are like, no, we don't want to stop wearing our masks. We don't want to stop harassing people on the street who don't have a mask on, right? And yeah, how does that play out? I don't know. Um,
They must get dopamine hits or something, or something like I, have you noticed how the term Karen used to mean someone who's a snitch, but now it means a COVID Karen is someone who doesn't want to wear a mask and is caught on video.
no, I haven't followed the way that has been repurposed. No, I didn't know there was this new
Yeah.
usage of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's been interesting to note and to watch. Yeah. The COVID Karen and how I don't know if this is, I mean, Orwell is so like overused as a parallel, but it's so true is in 1984, this use of language, flipping the definition of words and it means one thing. It's like gaslighting the populace into, this word represents a certain concept one week, and then the next week it means something else, almost like being at war one week with Eurasia and Oceania the next week.
Yeah. No, I've been thinking a lot of the exact same thoughts as far as that goes. This idea in 1984 that like the populace is just supposed to be eternally in the present, right? That you can't you can't be aware that last week the authorities were saying the exact opposite of what they're saying this week, right? That
Right.
you no. Your duty is to mindlessly believe and repeat and obey whatever it is they're saying today. And if what they're saying today is completely in contradiction to what they were saying yesterday, you're not allowed to even point that out, right? You're a bad person for even pointing that out. Yeah, it's interesting watching the way some of the kind of establishment progressive media figures and things, and politicians too, for that matter, are dealing with the rolling back of the mask mandates and all this sort of stuff, where um, some of them are having difficulty, right? It's like that classic meme of the guy who's like sweating and with the two
Press the
buttons.
buttons. Yeah.
Yeah. It's that one, right? It's like you know, I'm supposed to believe whatever the CDC says today. Oh no, they're saying I'm not supposed to wear a mask anymore, right? How do I square this cognitive dissonance?
Another interesting development that came out today is that Fauci said, and I just saw this on Twitter. He said that there is evidence that this came from a Wuhan lab. So I'd have to find that tweet again, but I'm wondering if this is going to come into the whole, um, come into the whole anti-China thing again. If we haven't seen the end of that.
Right. Yeah. No, I've wondered about that too, right? That when it was to this seeming benefit of the establishment to refuse to acknowledge even the possibility, right, of a lab leak or whatever, then they were like, no, You're a crazy, evil, racist, conspiracy theorist. If you even say it's possible that might have happened, that it might have come out of a lab. To now, it's a very gaslighty sort of a thing, because now it's like, no, now that's a legitimate possibility that we're actually really seriously considering. However, if you were opening this line of inquiry a year ago, you're still crazy.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Because respectable people just today started saying this is worth thinking about.
He says,
yeah,
this is the tweet. Fauci says he is, quote, not convinced COVID-19 developed naturally and calls for an open investigation into the virus's origins, according to the New York Post. So it's the New York Post.
Yeah, I mean, if they're looking to up the conflict with China, either in Cold War terms or in hot war terms, I can definitely see how they would change their tune on that particular issue in order to roll it into a demonizing China narrative, right? It's like, oh,
right.
these SOBs gave us COVID, and I'm sure they would even imply that maybe it wasn't even an accident,
right.
Maybe they just decided to screw with the entire world for some reason.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely a concern. And with Fauci too, you have to wonder because of, and I'm not an expert on the details, but I've kind of heard enough over the years that basically if you dig into this guy's past and his background and his career and his finances, like there's a lot of shady things there that you can pick apart. And how, if they're now starting to say, well, maybe it was a lab leak, are they doing that as part of a limited hangout?
Right. Yeah.
Where they're going to expose enough to maybe throw China under the bus for it, but then craft the narrative in such a way that they exculpate much of the U.S. elite from any complicity in all of that.
Or even going back to what you said earlier in the show about accidentally dropping the atomic bomb on North Carolina. They cover up their own incompetence by throwing someone under the bus, or even like in a truth sandwich, there's a truth sandwiched in between two lies, and that's how we'll control the narrative.
Yeah, and it's so tricky too, because the US elite has such a track record of blatant dishonesty that I never assume that what they say is true. That's not to say that they never say the truth. They say the truth when it is tactically, when they believe it's tactically to their advantage to tell the truth, they'll tell the truth.
Yeah.
But it's probably better statistically to just default position they're probably lying unless I have reason to believe they're not. But on the other hand, the Chinese Communist Party doesn't exactly have a great track record as far as that goes either, right? And so yeah, regular people who are trying to figure out the truth about things are left in the situation where, and that's not even taking into account the other major governments of the world and other like international institutions and the UN and the WHO and everything, where it's like none of these organizations have a track record that leads me to default think they're telling the truth. And so yeah, if the U.S. government and the Chinese Communist Party are each telling different stories, probably they're both lying in different ways. And trying to parse that apart is a really tricky sort of a job.
Yeah.
That, it's beyond me much of the time, to be honest with you.
Well, and like I said, there's only so many hours in the day, and you try and get at it, but so let me then bring this to a close on another white pill, though, is that I've said on the show many times that this is more fun to me than video games. We talk about how, it is difficult to read all these things and to be a part of this world a lot, but man, like, what would we do if the state didn't exist? I mean, there's something to rail against, is what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
There's the struggle. There's happiness in the struggle.
Yeah, no, there is. And that's, I think that's a good point to bring up, because, that is at the end of the day, what keeps us going, right? Even when we're, constantly up to our necks in these dark, depressing topics and stories and issues and things, is there is a certain satisfaction in and maybe it's our own self-serving narratives, but
Yeah.
there is a certain satisfaction of walking into the arena as David, going up against Goliath. Right there is a certain, of being the underdog, and everybody always thinks they're the underdog. But let's be honest, people like us, like maybe we're right, maybe we're wrong, but we're certainly not the favorites, right? We're certainly
Yeah.
not the people in the positions of institutional or economic or political power. And so whatever else you can say about, our sorts of people, like we're definitely underdogs pretty much everywhere. And I think there's a certain personality type that finds a certain amount of joy. The personality type that looks at something like the Alamo or looks at something like Thermopylae and is like, yeah, I get it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I get it. I respect those guys for just being like, I don't care. Let's, 300 of us, 10,000 of you. Let's do this.
Well, and Scott says on the Scott Horton show, he has it's like the bumpersticker.com, his advertisement. And he's like, oh, now I finally have something for you to like proclaim your oppositional defiant disorder. And I think that's me for sure. It's like, screw you.
Yeah. I think there's in terms of psychological traits, I think it's if you're high on the personality trait openness, but also simultaneously high on the personality trait of being disagreeable, right?
Yeah.
So or low on agreeableness, right? High on disagreeableness. That I took one of those tests. It might have even been Jordan Peterson's one, I forget, years ago, the big 5 personality traits. And that was like the only I was very high in openness and I was very low in agreeableness. And I think like that's the magical formula for people like us is the openness means you're open-minded enough about different ideas and perspectives that you're willing to give a serious hearing to, out of the mainstream views on things. You're willing to give those a serious look. And then the being low on agreeableness is like, oh, when I decide after some serious thinking and research that the mainstream narrative on this thing is completely wrong, I'm going to be like a bulldog on the truth as I see it. I'm gonna just relentlessly, no, I'm not gonna cave. I'm not gonna change my tune. I'm gonna keep telling the truth as I see it, come hell or high water.
Yeah. Hell yeah. Well, Guerrilla Scholar Warriors, how can everyone find your work?
DangerousHistoryPodcast.com or just, search Dangerous History Podcast in your favorite search engine or on your favorite podcast venue, and you'll probably find it.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for joining. I really enjoyed this, and we're definitely gonna have to do it again sometime.
Sounds good. I've enjoyed it. Yeah, this has been my first podcast conversation in probably close to 2 months. So yeah, it's been nice. I've enjoyed talking to you.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Back in the saddle. So I'm looking forward to seeing new content.
Yeah, I've got several things that I'm working on, hoping to get out in the next few weeks, and then after that, I'm going to be over the summer trying to jump back hard into the Wilson series again, which I've kind of had on hold for a little while. And then I've got several other mini series that I'm still in the kind of research and development process on, including potentially a mini series on World War I propaganda, like we've been talking about. And also probably over the summer going to try to at least start a mini series on the collapse of the Soviet Empire, which I covered a little bit in a fairly short episode very early in the show. But I want to go back to and really give it like a multi-hour, more detailed sort of a coverage. So yeah, that's in the works.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, looking forward to that. And you got to be careful with those timelines, CJ.
I know. I just forgot my own hard-won wisdom.
All right. Well, thanks again. We'll catch you later.
All right. Sounds good.